Hello and welcome to the Invisible Men. My name is Ian Rowe. Hey, Nique.
Hi, Ian. I'm Nique Yours. Happy to be here.
Yeah, great to see you as always. As our listeners know, we try to, each episode celebrate the amazing work of typically a Black man who's doing wonderful work, and we just want to make their work that often goes invisible. We want to make it invisible no more, and very proud that we have a repeat guest, the venerable Bob Woodson, to his colleagues and peers that have known him so well. Bob, for many in the audience, for decades has been a champion of social reform, of results in communities, and ultimately empowering people to become agents of their own uplift. Bob, great to see you again.
Always a pleasure to join you.
Yeah. And you're joining us on a special day. We're taping this episode on January 20th, 2025. And it is a day that is special because it's the anniversary of the birth of Martin Luther King Jr. It also happens to be the day of the inauguration, the peaceful transition of power to the 47th president, Donald J. Trump. And Bob, we really want to talk to you about both of these events, what the meaning is for the Black community, your reflections. But before we get there, always helpful to hear from you, just to give our audience a little sense of your background. And we always like to start off each of our sessions because we talk a lot about the issue of race. And, growing up, I've heard you speak a lot about what you experienced as a young man. But when was it that you realized that race was a thing, that your skin color had meaning, either in terms of how other people perceived you or you perceived yourself?
Well, growing up in South Philadelphia, a low-income Black neighborhood, contrary to what most people believe, we were always separated by class. Lawyers and doctors did not live in the same neighborhood as trash collectors and factory workers. There was always economic bifurcation in the Black community. So I lived in a low-income, blue-collar neighborhood that was more like a village. 98% of the households had a man and a woman raising children. All the kids could read because we had to read out loud in those days. So you knew who could read and who could not. Right. But also in this enclave, as I have said, that never heard a gunfire from the time I was born to 17. Never heard of an elderly people could not walk safely in their community without fear of being assaulted by their grandchildren. Never heard of a child shot in his crib. It was just unheard of during that time. And so, but we also were racially separated because even in urban centers, amusement parks and swimming pools, you couldn't attend because they were segregated.
Yep.
And also, I remember the only time when I'd go to the movies and I saw people, having fun, there's always white people. And I used to say to my mother and others, you know what? That man in the movie was an architect. I want to be an architect so I can do what he did. And she said, son, Black people are not architects.
Oh, wow.
And I heard that message over and over again, that when you come, it wasn't said with any any disdain or whatnot. It just said the reality is Black people are not this. Nevertheless, you were still motivated to learn, and because of the environment in which you're in. And so my dad died when I was 9, leaving my mother with a 5th grade education and 5 children to raise. So I guess I gained an appreciation, but I had to turn to peers to be a substitute family.
Yep.
But fortunately, I was blessed with the kind of values. I chose good friends.
Right. So it's interesting. I don't think I've ever heard you talk about it in this way. So the fact that you were bifurcated by class, what did it make you think when you did see that there was a community when the black community that was middle or upper class? Did that make it seem to you that that you could succeed in America as a black person?
Yeah, let me explain and clarify. Even though we were low income, we had middle class values. I mean, the most respected person in our neighborhood was Mr. Johnson, who was a barber, but he was also the superintendent of the Sunday school.
Right.
And so we were surrounded with people with middle class values, low income, but middle class values. They went to
Yep.
church. Men respected women. Women didn't smoke or drink or hang in bars. There were rigid standards of moral conduct that governed us. That's very important to understand. Class is
Sure.
not associated with income,
Right.
and
Or the
so
values that you have. Right.
or the values. But also when we had third grade plays, they were held at night, and so that parents could attend. And those little auditoriums were packed with parents. You see lunch pails on a table in the back of the room because people were coming from work and putting their lunch pails there and then participating. So it was a close knit, family oriented, wholesome environment where children were encouraged to read. Our middle class teachers lived in West Philadelphia and came in. And I remember one teacher and her husband, Miss Thompson, took me home in West Philadelphia for a weekend, and I felt I was in paradise. I saw lawns and I saw big streets and whatnot. So there was clearly an economic class separation in that time. But again, it's important. But the same values that were present among middle class economically were also true about low income people. So that's people, they miss that point.
So, Bob, I want to make sure I correct a narrative that I've been pushing for a while because it sounds like I'm wrong. I've historically said that during our segregation, one of the reasons we were so much more successful is because those that were maybe formerly less educated saw people that were lawyers and doctors and could aspire to that. But you're saying you didn't see those folks.
No, no, no. Dr. Sanders came into our neighborhood once a month for 2 days to minister to people. But I never knew where he lived. But Dr. Sanders had an office in our neighborhood. No, that was, and again, I'm talking about my city of Philadelphia. I don't know what the rest of the country is, but I'm assuming that if it's true in an urban center, because when my dad moved us out of South Philly, and then I moved in West Philly. That's when we saw doctors across the street and whatnot. But the values that in other words, there's an incorrect assumption that professionally trained people have a different level, a higher level of values in terms of moral conduct than low income people. That is something that is often gets stated that drives me crazy. That deprived does not mean you're depraved.
Wow. Deprived does not mean that you are depraved. Okay.
No.
Brilliant.
When you had people living as sharecroppers, man, they didn't riot or steal from stores and do anything like that, and they were sharecroppers. And so that's a very important myth that we must dismiss. That
Yes.
somehow being deprived makes you depraved. You're stealing because you're poor. No, that's not true.
Yeah.
It's not.
Well, that seems to be the narrative present day for some, right? When they justify, riots or unseemly behavior because of poverty. How do we counteract that narrative?
We counteract it not by writing white papers and issuing them or condemning those who promote it. It is holding up people who witness to the contrary. You see, when I get into, I don't debate people with my ideas. I hold a witness up to what I believe. So they have to come. When I was debating Hawk Newman for an hour on YouTube, I kept hitting him. He wasn't debating Bob Woodson. He was debating reality. I said,
Mm.
Hawk, if we close the education gap between 1920 and 1940 in the South from 3 years to 6 months because of the Rosenwald Booker T schools, if we had 5 high schools at the turn of the century with used textbooks, half the budgets of white schools, and every one of those black high schools out-tested every white school in the city, how can you claim that racism today prevents us from performing when we outperform whites under worse circumstances? When racism was enshrined in law.
Yep.
So what is your explanation for it?
And what is the explanation? What's the response you hear back?
Well, you don't understand. It's systemic racism. I said, oh, so that's what they hit you with. Oh, it's systemic. I said, in other words, white folks have a little magic wand or a remote control device that they ride past a black school and they aim it at that school to compel those teachers to miseducate their children. Is that
Wow.
what you're telling me? Is that systemic racism?
Wow.
And so when you hit him with that, he doesn't know what to say. They just keep backing up and giving spurious kind of responses. Like
And of course, that magic wand also has the ability to separate Nigerians and Ghanaians from African Americans and Jamaicans and Haitians from African Americans. It's incredibly powerful in its ability to pinpoint and target. Yeah, I mean, it's. I just want to state the obvious, like the narrative you've just described, Bob, and the reality of living during that period of time, and the fact that today there's probably 6x the opportunity, and yet we complain more about the obstacles that are supposedly in front of us. It's a doggone shame.
Well,
It's
my
a disgrace.
Lano Squires, and I quote him all the time. I think he's brilliant. And he framed it beautifully. He said, this whole narrative is driven by a small group of elite guilty whites who are seeking absolution from injustices, from crimes they never committed. And entitled blacks who are seeking absolution from injustice they never suffered. Somebody born in the last 20 years went to Morehouse. Man, you haven't suffered. Come on. This cracks me up. And I left her unnamed, but she was a dean of one of the major black colleges. She was talking about racism and whatnot, but she just told me that she and her fraternity sisters, just 30 of them, just returned from Paris, were celebrating the 73rd birthday of a friend. A week in Paris celebrating a birthday, and they are
Yes.
deprived and victims of racism and system. I mean, I just sat there, shook my head. 30 of
Well,
them.
I mean, right, and no, I mean, it's a ridiculous narrative. I mean, I think the one thing I know that you're sensitive to is people interpret see, Bob Woodson is saying that racism doesn't exist, and all you're saying is that the type of when racism was enshrined into law in the era that you were growing up versus now, it's not that interpersonal racism doesn't exist between human beings. It's just saying that to whatever degree it's an issue, it's no longer the insurmountable issue. And in fact, even you're saying even back then it wasn't insurmountable when it was enshrined into law, right? So I just think it's important because there are those who grab onto this narrative and say, well, you guys are just denying reality. You're saying racism doesn't exist at all.
No, but I'm more cynical than that. Going back to my young civil rights days, when I walked across the line of cynicism is when if you heard me say, when I was 25, I deposed Bill Johnson, who was a 40-year-old chemist from Lincoln University, or the head of the Human Relations Council. That was our civil rights group. I deposed him and voted him out, and I got him voted in at 25. And I'm leading demonstrations against segregated schools and whatnot. but I parted company on the issue of integration versus desegregation. I fought for desegregation, not integration, and busing. And so my civil rights colleague says, well, Bob, well, your position is compatible with that with the Klan and the John Birch Society. I said, if Hitler likes classical music and I do, am I supposed to stop liking classical music? You don't take your positions based on what someone else thinks about. They have their own reasons for taking those positions.
Well, yes, and also there's something very subtle about what you're saying, because there's a big difference between desegregation and forced integration,
Yes,
right? Because the underlying message of forced integration is, well, those black kids need white kids in order to succeed,
exactly.
right? That somehow a racially segregated school is inherently inferior, right?
Even more cynical than that, I debated Julius Chambers, a lawyer from Harvard, before the New York Bar Association on the same topic. You know, he's a smart guy, Harvard graduate, whatnot. And so I'm not debating him. So midway through the debate, I said, Julius, we have two circumstances. Circumstance A, where the school is all black and there's the presence of excellence. School B, where there's diminished excellence, but it's integrated. Where should we send our children? He said to school B.
Oh.
I said, if you believe that, then we got no more to debate.
Mm-mm.
Because I believe if you produce a school or anything that has excellence as its core, you will attract whites, as Margaret
Well,
Collins did in
and,
East
and,
Side
and,
of
right.
Chicago.
And by the way, it's not even about attracting white families, right? I mean,
Uh,
I run schools in the Bronx, in areas of the Bronx where, let's just put it this way, there are not very many white families that are sending their, but if you build a school where it's all black and Hispanic or whatever the demographic makeup is, our expectations are not diminished, right?
yeah.
It's not as if you say, "Oh my God, you have it's only black and Hispanic demographic. I guess you can't achieve at the highest levels, period, regardless of race."
You see, I'm much more explicit than that. I'm when you get old, man, you take shortcuts. My shortcut is listen. We need to have a 2-year moratorium and whining about white folks.
Fine.
Two
Where
years,
do I sign?
Yeah.
2 years where we don't mention white folks at all. Because I told her if they were to go to Europe and Canada tomorrow, we would still be killing each other. We still would not be performing in schools. All of the major things that we need to be about to promote flourishing would not exist. Leave them alone.
Mm,
But the people who are preoccupied with them profit from this tension and
mm,
this conflict. They're
mm.
grievance merchants. Booker T. Washington said the same thing. He said they're a group of Negroes who thrive on our grievance. If we lose our grievance, they lose their income.
Right.
And that's what you have. And so many examples, and that drove me crazy, drove me out of the civil rights movement in '68. It was forced busing for integration. We had two young principals that came to Prince George's County and took over the public school, failing schools. He really got the parents involved. They were coming in on weekends and studying, working. The grades began to soar. The NAACP stepped in and said, "No, we need to bus them." I mean, it was excellent. Oh, I went crazy. But but their children weren't in those schools. They were
Right.
Sidwell friends.
Hmm.
Eleanor Holmes Norton, Jesse Jackson, Frank Smith, who was superintendent of DC schools, withdrew his daughter from public school and put her in Sidwell Friends when he was superintendent of the DC schools. And no one saw no moral contradiction in that. Because middle class blacks do not hold other middle class blacks accountable.
Yep.
Either they're directly benefiting from the race grievance industry, or they're silent because most of their friends benefit from our grievance.
Wow. Okay. So then let's fast forward to today. We're celebrating the legacy of Martin Luther King, and we're inaugurating a new president, or a repeat president, Donald Trump. Let's talk initially about MLK and where you think we stand as a Black community relative to the vision that he laid out 40,
When
50 years ago.
I think there are elements of his ministry that don't get discussed enough. It isn't just vision that he laid out, but he was a true leader, because true leaders don't just reflect popular opinion or the consensus of the majority. They're willing to confront other leaders in the shaping of that. Everybody loves his "I Have a Dream" speech. For me, the one that I think is most important is "Letter from a Birmingham Jail," when he says that that lukewarm acceptance from people of goodwill is more difficult to outright, that the greatest stumbling block to Black progress is not the White Citizens Council or the KKK, it's the white moderate. That lukewarm acceptance from people of goodwill is more difficult to tolerate than outright rejection of people of ill will. The civil rights leaders went crazy because they said, you're going to alienate the white leadership who is funding us. And so they castigated him. When Dr. King joined the civil rights movement with the peace movement, I was sitting on a dais with Roy Wilkins, who just castigated him to the no end. Carl Rowan said he was a communist. But Dr. King, in true form, refused to change. And instead, he stood firm on that conviction and brought the whole Black community and the nation around to his position. It's the same with civil disobedience in going to going to Greensboro. He was sent to Greensboro to tell the students not to engage in civil disobedience. But the students told him either lead, follow, or get out the way.
Wow, there it is.
So there was three incidents where King challenged the civil rights leadership in its actions and its principles. And there was really debate between Booker T. Washington, from King, Malcolm, the Muslims, and that's why you got the splintering. In other words, the success of the civil rights movement was due in part to its own Tea Party fraction. That's why you had SNCC, SCLC, all these other splinters, organizations. The National Baptist Convention split because King wanted them to embrace civil disobedience, and the National Baptist Convention leadership said no. And so they split and became the Progressive Baptists. So even to this day, the split exists. But all of these things I'm telling you are fracturing, and that's healthy. It means we were engaged in an active debate. There is no debate today. If you're not a race grievance monger, you're an Uncle Tom.
Right. Let's talk about Oh, go ahead, Nique.
I just one point in. So, Bob, speaking of the '60s, I wanted to get your perspective. Obviously, during the 1960s, there were seismic assassinations of incredible leaders. I just wanted to get your perspective on which one of the assassinations do you think had the greatest negative impact on our country? And specifically, you've got King, you've got Malcolm, you've got President Kennedy, and you've got Senator Kennedy. Which one of those had the greatest negative impact?
I think King and Malcolm, because I was ready to get on a train and go to New York and follow Malcolm X when he came back from Mecca and shed his Muslim identity and became more of a universalist. I believe that so he was, as long as Malcolm had remained a Muslim, he was safe. The moment you pivot and began to embrace a larger agenda, that's what put him in peril. And I think that's why he was assassinated. As long as King was transfixed on civil rights issue and left the war alone, he would have been all right. So I just think that, but the assassination of King and Malcolm were horrific in Senate. It really set us back because that's when we engaged in the rioting that tore up our own communities. Okay, those are the two that I think um, signal change.
Yeah, and those two also preach the philosophy of self-determination
Yes.
and self-sufficiency as a community. And there certainly is a segment of the Black community today that follows that. You know, there's a segment of our community that's married, religious faith, productive employment, and yet there's a segment that's not. What do you think, now to pivot to the new president, or the repeating president? There clearly was a shift in the Black community of the message that they have typically heard about how we as a community need to move forward, but there was a greater rejection of messages of dependency. So what do you think? What do you think about that? Is that right?
Yeah, I think so. And that's why I say that Obama had an opportunity to be a post-racial president and move us in a different direction. You remember his commencement address at Morehouse when he emphasized personal responsibility of Black men to be fathers. And he was attacked by Jesse Jackson.
Yes.
And from then, you didn't hear any more about it. He then got into personal survival mode. And the next thing you know, he was saying that Trayvon Martin could have been my son. That signaled to me he had abandoned any pretense of wanting to bring us together and unite us around real self-help issues. Trump is the first non-guilty white man that I think has been in the White House in 50 years. And that's refreshing. That's somebody who doesn't patronize us. The rest have been patronizing. I would prefer an old-fashioned bigot than someone who patronizes me or is a Black traitor.
Mm, mm. Why is patronizing so harmful to the community that is being patronized?
Two things. There are two ways that you can deny someone an opportunity to compete. One is deny them by law, the way we did under segregation. But the most insidious way is to tell them you don't have to compete. That you're just too weak to compete.
Mm.
You don't even
or you need our help.
You need our help. Unless I am able to deliver you from you, you can't possibly achieve any level of self-sufficiency. And when you put this into the minds of people, when you constantly say to Black and white kids that you live in a country that hates you, or that if you're white, you're an oppressor, and if you're Black, you're a victim, after a while, that message begins to get accepted by young people, and they begin to believe that maybe I'm unworthy. Maybe I'm just unworthy of self-sufficiency or being able to deliver myself. And maybe that's why you have this epidemic of suicide and drug overdose deaths of young people and homicides in the city. I just think this rash of deaths among our young people is a crisis in self-esteem. It's a moral and spiritual crisis where they're taking their lives. If you learn to devalue life, then you'll take your own or someone else's. It's different sides of the same coin.
Yeah.
But as long as we are locked into this racial narrative, we will never get at that hole that's in the hearts of our children. And that's
Bob,
why we must become post-racial. We must get race off of the table.
2-year moratorium. Where do I sign up? Bob, I don't want to take us off President Trump because I think, boy, you said he's the first. Basically, say he's the first president that doesn't have guilt over race. I think that is so powerful and so accurate. But if you, Bob, had $50 billion to invest back into America, what are one or two areas or initiative points of focus that you would put that money against?
I would go into these communities where I have seen islands of moral and spiritual and economic excellence, like the Piney Wood School in Jackson, Mississippi,
Yes, sir.
where they are delivering children 100% coming from these troubled communities are graduating, going on to college, some of them with 3 scholarships. I would make sure that in their mandatory work, mandatory chapel, their Christian values are set front and center. I would take, and John Ponder has in Las Vegas, there's 5,000 people who come out of prison and less than 6% go back. They just built an opportunity center in the prison yard so people can learn to be plumbers and carpenters and whatnot. So there are islands of excellence where people have demonstrated that by taking some of these old values and apply them to our contemporary situation, communities can be rebuilt from the inside out. We just need to take some of these models and invest in them. There are 10 schools, Ian, you've introduced me to one, where there are educational islands of excellence. We need to get these leaders and bring them together in one place and let them tell us what is the gap between what they can afford to do and what they're capable of doing.
Mm.
And take a portion of that $50 million and invest it directly into these islands of excellence with the goal of spreading what they're doing to other communities. I would fund them, help evaluate them, strengthen them, bring them into a consortium, and then say to the rest of the Pharaohs and Josephs in Kansas City, I would get together a group of 6 wealthy Pharaohs and then 6 wholesome schools and marry them to say, you all need to be a Pharaoh-Joseph relationship. And I'd have these Pharaoh-Joseph relationships all over the country.
That feels actionable to me. And it goes back to your point. You don't discuss and debate on ideas. You discuss and debate on results and achievements. And as you rightly said, there are dozens, if not hundreds, of islands of excellence
Right.
that should be invested in. No different than investing in startup companies that have incredible potential
Right.
to solve complex problems.
Because the message from this election is that the Democrats thought they could get Beyonce to come and shake her booty and that Obama to shake his finger. And somehow blacks would then vote the way they instructed them to vote. So this election was a rejection of elitism as well.
Right. I mean, it is amazing. I think when Kamala Harris, her first major event, they brought out Megan the Stallion to twerk on stage.
Yes.
Think about that as the message. Like, what does that say they think of the black community? Because that's who they were trying to appeal to.
She also said that she's going to legalize marijuana and
Right.
provide economic means for black men to sell it.
That was her economic plan.
That was her economic plan for black men.
Go sell drugs.
Go sell drugs. And so this was.
By the way, if a Ku Klux Klansman had come up with that idea, right? People would say, Oh, you're trying to sell drugs that are going to destroy the community, right?
They
That's
certainly
how
would.
that's how it would be interpreted.
Right. But that's why we need to return to a single standard, man. But to answer, so that what we're trying to do at the Woodson Center is provide a model for the Pharaoh Joseph investment. We're trying to raise $20 million so we can present a check for $20 million to the Pineywood School so they can restore all of their historic buildings that were built by the students. And also, it has what I like about the Pineywood. If it wasn't for an ex-slave who was rich and deeded 40 acres of land to them, and a white mill worker that donated 10,000 square feet of lumber at a time when it was illegal to teach blacks to read in Mississippi. To me, this is Americana. This is American action. And this relationship between whites in Mississippi and blacks, Helen Keller taught there.
Oh, wow. I didn't
They
know
were
that.
the first school to teach blind children. The Mississippi Five Blind Boys, the gospel group,
Yeah.
they were created at Pineywood. So they had a white woman who came down and became resident and taught Braille to the students. So Pineywood has had a rich tradition of interracial cooperation in the service of creating excellence. This is the American story. Now you can talk about all the whites who lynched blacks and the blacks who are lynched. That certainly is an important story, but it's an incomplete story.
Right. Well, Bob, that's the basis of the curriculum that we worked
Yes.
on over the last few years, right? The Woodson Center put together a curriculum focused on the African American experience in the United States from a historical perspective, and it's told warts and all. It doesn't cherry pick the most negative elements, nor does it sanitize and say, only America is great, but you tell the whole story. And how many times has that been downloaded now, Bob?
Over 200,000 now in all 50 states. We're up to over 200,000 downloads in all
Amazing.
states. So an animated version of it is coming out. That's going to tell some of these stories in animation. And the Pathways is coming out. What we're trying to do here is bring about cooperation, a synthesis between our scholars and our activists. Because right now, elitism on both left and the right is preventing the rich font of wisdom that exists in these low-income communities from being revealed. I spent all my life recording, supporting, listening to, learning from the wisdom that comes from everyday people employing common sense to the problems that we face. And that's what's missing. That's why the word enterprise used to be in our name, because we look at them as social entrepreneurs.
Mm.
And entrepreneurs tend to be C students, not A students.
Right. All right. Well, Bob, we're coming close to an end. But two more things. Just what do you see over the next 4 years? What are you optimistic?
I am optimistic as I can be. I think that the Lord has prepared us for these trials and tribulations. And the very fact that Trump says, he has made that most of the blacks who voted for him, according to polls, didn't vote for him. They voted against the policies of Biden. But they were also encouraged by Trump's invitation. And the question is, can he deliver on that promise?
Yep.
That they said, don't tell me that someone is racist. I'm more concerned about having a safe community and money in my pocket. I'm less concerned about whether someone's a racist. And so I think it's important that I'm encouraged that that the table has been set. I know I'm trying to use contacts that I have to say to the president, we have a group of 3,500 grassroots leaders in 39 states who are Josephs, who are ready to reclaim their lives and also their communities.
Yeah. Well, then let me end with our final question that we actually ask of all of our guests. The advice that they would give to Daryl, who's this imaginary 16-year-old black kid living in forgotten USA, who maybe heretofore has only heard the narrative that America is an oppressive country, it is rigged against you, and maybe they heard something different in this last election. What advice would you give to Daryl now? Maybe that it isn't just a given that this everything about this country is designed for your failure or destruction.
Daryl does not need an advocate, he needs a witness. He needs to meet Camille Bradley, 23-year-old black woman whose mother had 3 children by 3 different men. She's psychotic. She was homeless, moved 9 times in high school, but connected with a Christian mentor. And they took her on an airplane ride above the city, helicopter. She got turned on to flying and finished high school at the top of her class, first one to finish high school, and now did her graduate studies in aeronautics, and at 23 years old is a licensed pilot, commercial pilot. And there are 10 or 12 stories of restoration and redemption that Daryl needs to meet.
Mm-hmm.
And we have an obligation to identify people like that people are motivated to change when they see a sermon, not when they hear a sermon. And that values are not taught, they're caught.
Mm.
And so with Daryl meets Camille Bradley, and you see how articulate she is, and meet other young men and women who have struggled and achieved against the odds. And so in every opportunity we have to identify people like that and shine a light on them, or to write in our books about them or highlight them in our literature, we should always be looking for examples of moral excellence from people who have achieved against the odds. Every scholar, every journalist, every activist in any way should take a small portion of what they write about and devote to holding up these examples of moral and spiritual excellence.
Well, Bob Woodson, I think Nike, you and I are like Daryl, seeing you,
100%.
witnessing your moral excellence, and just standing up and being a model for what is right. Always, Bob. You're incredible. You're an inspiration. And thank you for being a guest again on The Invisible Men.
Well, thank you. I don't strive to be famous. I just strive to be faithful.
Wow. And we should, I think I may steal that one from you, Bob.
Be my guest. I
Okay.
steal from you without you knowing. All the time.
All right. Okay. Outstanding. Outstanding. Well, thank you for listening to another episode of The Invisible Men. You can catch all of our episodes on www.invisible.men. Nike, as always, great to see you.
Great seeing you, Ian. Thank you, dear elder. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Onward.